My name is Thaddeus Kellerman. I am a master distiller who survived the first 78 days of the Ice Age apocalypse. When volcanic ash blocked the sun, temperatures plummeted to -70. I watched 12 desperate survivors fight over dwindling supplies in my isolated mountain laboratory while outside. Wolves hunted humans. My knowledge of chemistry kept us alive, but also forced me to make decisions no man should face. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. I never thought my knowledge of making moonshine would determine who lives and who dies. Most folks saw me as just another Appalachian distiller with fancy chemistry degrees, but when the world froze over, those same folks looked at my hands differently. These hands that once crafted small batch bourbon now craft the difference between survival and freezing to death in the dark. My name is Thaddeus Kellerman. I want to record this account while the details are still fresh, while I can still feel the bite of that unnatural cold on my skin. I look different now than I did 78 days ago when this all started. Thinner, harder. The frostbite took small patches of skin from my left cheek and the tips of 2 fingers. But I survived. Some of us survived. What I am about to tell you is not just about survival. It is about what freezing temperatures do to the human soul. How quickly the veneer of civilization cracks when the mercury drops below 0 and keeps falling. Before the world changed, I ran the Appalachian Spirits Cooperative, a combination distillery and agricultural research laboratory nestled deep in the mountains of Kentucky. We were innovators, combining traditional mountain moonshining techniques with modern chemistry to create spirits that won international awards. But more importantly, we developed sustainable farming methods, specialized fermentation processes, and chemical applications that few others understood. My laboratory was my sanctuary. After 15 years in the military and then earning my chemistry degree, I chose isolation deliberately. I built my facility far from main roads, with its own power systems, water filtration, and extensive stockpiles of chemicals. Not because I feared the end of the world, but because I valued precision and control in my work. Independence was merely a beneficial side effect. The last time I spoke to my daughter Eliza was 3 months before the freeze. She told me my obsession with self-sufficiency was pathological, that I had chosen test tubes over people, over family. She had moved west after college, working at some agricultural research center in Montana. Now I wonder if that same obsession she criticized kept her alive when the cold came. I first noticed something was wrong in late November. The volcanic activity reports started appearing in scientific journals, not mainstream news. Minor eruptions along the Pacific Ring of Fire were occurring at unusual frequencies. My colleague at the University of Kentucky sent me atmospheric, particulate readings that showed concerning levels of ash at high altitudes. Most people dismiss these as isolated incidents. When you work with fermentation and distillation daily, you develop a sense for when systems are about to fail catastrophically. A single-degree temperature change can ruin a batch of mash. Minor contamination can destroy months of work. You learn to watch for subtle signs of impending failure, and all my instincts were screaming that something was very wrong with our planetary systems. I began testing air samples with my laboratory equipment. The particulate levels were rising steadily, even in our remote mountain location. I increased my supply runs to town, quietly stockpiling extra food and chemicals that would become invaluable later. The locals thought I was just preparing for a harsh winter. They had no idea. December 12th was when everything changed. I was checking fermentation temperatures in the main distillery when emergency alerts began blaring from my phone and the radio simultaneously. Reports of massive volcanic eruptions, not just in the Pacific now, but globally. Something had triggered a cascade effect, multiple major volcanoes erupting within hours of each other. The scientific community called it a volcanic synchronicity event, something theorized but never before documented. I stood outside that afternoon and watched the sky change color. The clear blue transformed to a sickly gray-yellow as ash spread in the upper atmosphere. By sunset, the temperature had already dropped 10 degrees below normal. The news switched from scientific explanations to panic as reporters struggled to keep up with the cascading effects across the globe. By hour 18, The thermometer had dropped 26 degrees. By hour 36, cell towers were failing as power grids collapsed under the strain of everyone, turning up their heat simultaneously. By hour 48, I heard the first gunshots from the direction of town. That first week of isolation was strangely peaceful compared to what came after. I implemented my emergency protocols, more out of scientific thoroughness than actual fear. I converted part of the distillery to living quarters, calculated supply longevity, and set up weather monitoring systems. The readings were unlike anything in recorded history. The volcanic ash had created a reflective layer in the atmosphere, bouncing solar radiation back into space instead of warming our planet. Each day the temperature dropped further. Wildlife appeared around my property in unusual numbers and combinations. Deer and wolves moving together, too desperate to maintain natural predator-prey relationships. Birds fell frozen from the sky. The cold was killing indiscriminately. I kept my radio on constantly, listening to the increasingly desperate reports. The National Emergency Broadcast System detailed evacuation plans for northern states, directing people south where temperatures remained marginally survivable. But the system was overwhelmed almost immediately. Roads became impassable as vehicles ran out of fuel or froze in place. The electrical grid failed section by section, and still the temperature continued to drop. Those first 7 days of solitude were a blessing I did not recognize at the time. Once others arrived, innocence became the first casualty of the freeze. On the 8th day, I was testing a new method for extracting heat from chemical reactions when I heard pounding at my reinforced laboratory door. I grabbed my shotgun before answering. Trust freezes quickly in a world gone cold. The Henderson family stood huddled on my doorstep, half frozen and desperate. Jack, the father, worked as a mechanic in the town 20 miles away. I had met him a few times during supply runs. His wife Sarah clutched their 2 children, a 5-year-old boy and a 7-year-old girl. Jack's hands were turning black with frostbite. Their truck had run out of fuel 3 miles down the mountain, and they had walked through snow up to their knees to reach the only place with smoke still coming from the chimney. I had to make a calculation I never wanted to make. 4 more people meant my carefully measured supplies would last significantly less time. But looking at those children, their faces red from cold and eyes vacant with shock, there was no real choice to make. I brought them inside and immediately began treating Jack's frostbite using chemicals from my laboratory. The early intervention saved his fingers, though he never regained full sensation in them. Sarah was tougher than she looked. Immediately, organizing the children and asking how she could help conserve resources. The little boy, Jake, had not spoken since watching their neighbors fight over the last generator at the hardware store. Some forms of cold go deeper than skin. The Hendersons brought news from town that confirmed my worst fears. The municipal power had failed within 48 hours. The grocery store was looted by the 3rd day. The National Guard had attempted evacuations but could only take a fraction of the population before their vehicles stopped functioning in the extreme cold. Those left behind were on their own. I showed the Hendersons how to manage the wood stove, how to maintain the delicate balance of oxygen and fuel to maximize heat with minimal consumption. I explained the importance of our chemical supplies, how certain compounds could be used to generate heat through controlled reactions. Jack's mechanical knowledge complemented my chemistry background, and soon we had improved several of my emergency systems. 3 days later, more survivors arrived. A retired couple who had been my neighbors 10 miles down the mountain, a nurse from the local clinic, traveling alone after her husband died of exposure, 2 college students who had been hiking in the national forest when the freeze began, surviving initially on supplies from an emergency cabin. By day 15, my laboratory housed 12 people in a space designed for 3. Each breath condensed on the ceiling and rained back down as ice crystals. We were living in a human terrarium of desperation. The outside temperature had dropped to 30 degrees below zero and was still falling. I never wanted to lead anyone. In my previous life, I chose test tubes over people. But knowledge is power, and my understanding of chemical reactions suddenly made me responsible for 11 lives besides my own. I established work rotations, assigning tasks based on skills and physical condition. The nurse, Ellen, set up a medical station using my laboratory equipment. Jack handled mechanical repairs. Sarah organized food preparation to minimize waste. Conflicts emerged almost immediately. The retired couple, the Mitchells, felt entitled to larger rations due to their age. One of the college students, Marcus, questioned every decision I made. The other, Lily, barely spoke, spending hours staring out the windows at the endless snow. Everyone carried the trauma of what they had witnessed differently. I used my knowledge of fermentation to preserve our dwindling food supplies, converting starches to acids that would prevent spoilage. I taught the group basic chemistry principles that might keep them alive if something happened to me. I distilled alcohol not for drinking, but for disinfectant, fuel, and trade if necessary. By day 20, the thermometer outside read 40 below zero. Inside, we maintained a temperature just above freezing in most of the laboratory, concentrating our living activities in the main distillation room where the copper stills radiated precious heat from our carefully rationed fires. I spent evenings repairing an old shortwave radio I found in storage, scavenging parts from laboratory equipment we could survive without. On day 23, we made contact with the outside world for the first time in weeks. The voice on the other end belonged to a ham radio operator in a military installation 200 miles south. He confirmed what we had feared. The infrastructure collapse was complete across the northern hemisphere. Government evacuation efforts had failed as equipment froze and fuel supplies dwindled. The southern states were overwhelmed with refugees, leading to violence and border closures between states. He also mentioned rumors that deeply disturbed me. Reports of cannibalism in isolated communities where food had run out. At the time, I thought it was hysteria. I had not yet seen what true hunger does to people. That night, after everyone was asleep, I did a complete inventory of our remaining supplies. The calculations were grim. At current consumption rates, we had perhaps 20 more days before critical shortages began. I would need to implement stricter rationing, but even that would only buy us another week at most. What I did not know then was that someone had already been taking more than their fair share. The cold was teaching us all hard lessons about human nature, about the fragility of trust and the brittleness of morality when survival is at stake. As I recalculated our supplies for the third time that night, the thermometer outside registered another record low. Beyond my laboratory walls, the world had become a frozen wasteland. Inside, a different kind of cold was taking hold in the human heart. Most people think a still is just for making whiskey or bourbon. They see copper coils and wooden barrels and think only of the end product. But a distillation system is fundamentally about separation and purification. It is about taking something complex and breaking it down to its essential elements. In the frozen world we now inhabited, that skill became our lifeline. I began converting my distillery equipment for survival applications immediately after. The Henderson family arrived. The large copper pot stills, normally used for whiskey production, became water purification systems. Snow had to be melted and filtered before consumption, as the extreme cold concentrated any contaminants to dangerous levels. The copper itself radiated heat efficiently, allowing us to position sleeping areas around the stills after each use. My fermentation knowledge proved crucial for extending our food supplies. Fermentation not only preserves food, but can increase nutritional availability in certain foods. I taught Sarah Henderson how to create lacto-fermented vegetables from our dwindling fresh supplies, extending their usefulness and providing beneficial bacteria that would help prevent illness in our increasingly crowded conditions. The production of alcohol itself became vital, though not primarily for drinking. High-proof ethanol served as disinfectant for medical applications, fuel for certain equipment, and as a base for tinctures with medicinal properties. I had extensive catalogs of herbs and their chemical components, allowing us to create primitive but effective treatments for pain, inflammation, and minor infections. Perhaps most valuable was my ability to extract heat from chemical reactions. Using combinations of chemicals from my laboratory stores, I could create controlled exothermic reactions that produced significant heat without the fire and carbon monoxide dangers of traditional combustion. These chemical heat packs became our most precious resource as the temperature outside continued its relentless decline. The Henderson children watched me work with wide eyes. Jake, who had been silent since their arrival, finally spoke when I showed him how to measure chemicals precisely, his small voice asking why certain combinations produced heat while others did not. I found myself explaining basic chemical principles to a 5-year-old whose world had collapsed around him. Teaching became a form of normalcy for both of us. When the next group of survivors arrived, they were in far worse condition than the Hendersons had been. The Mitchell couple, both in their 70s, had survived by burning furniture in their fireplace after their heating oil ran out. Mrs. Mitchell had severe smoke inhalation issues that required immediate attention. Ellen, the nurse, worked with me to create a nebulizer solution using distilled alcohol and herbs with anti-inflammatory properties. The college students, Marcus and Lily, had a different kind of damage. Physical frostbite on their extremities, but also a psychological frostbite that manifested in Marcus's aggressive questioning and Lily's near catatonic silence. They had found another hiker dead from exposure on their journey to my laboratory. The experience had affected them differently, but equally deeply. 2 more arrivals completed our group. Frank, a local postal worker who knew every back road in the county, had managed to reach us through a route others would never have found. And Karen, a high school chemistry teacher who had recognized the potential of seeking out a distillery when her home became unlivable. Her knowledge complemented mine, allowing us to work in shifts on critical chemical processes. With 12 people, the laboratory became dangerously overcrowded. Each person exhaled moisture with every breath, creating ice buildup on every surface. Condensation dripped from the ceiling and froze again on the floor, creating hazardous conditions. We had to establish strict rules about movement and activities to prevent dangerous increases in humidity. Food rationing became our first major point of contention. I calculated precise caloric needs based on body weight, age, and activity level, creating a scientifically optimized distribution system. Mr. Mitchell immediately protested that seniors needed more food due to their vulnerability. Marcus argued that those doing physical labor required larger portions. Both had valid points from certain perspectives, but the hard mathematics of our supplies could not accommodate exceptions. I found myself becoming a reluctant leader, making decisions that affected everyone's survival. I assigned work duties based on skills and physical capabilities. Jack Henderson, despite his damaged hands, could still repair mechanical systems. Ellen maintained our medical station. Frank organized our perimeter security, keeping watch for both animal predators and human scavengers. Everyone had purpose, except for Lily, who could barely function. The strain of close quarters and limited resources began to show by the end of the first month. Arguments erupted over minor infractions of our rules. Personal hygiene became both more difficult and more crucial as we lived in such proximity. Water for washing had to be strictly rationed, yet maintaining cleanliness was essential to prevent disease spread in our enclosed environment. I spent hours teaching basic chemistry to anyone willing to learn. The knowledge could not remain solely in my head if we were to survive long-term. Karen understood the principles quickly, becoming my deputy for critical processes. Jake Henderson absorbed information like a sponge, his young mind adapting to our new reality faster than the adults. Even Marcus, despite his confrontational nature, showed aptitude for the precise measurements required. Trust issues emerged as supplies began to dwindle faster than my calculations predicted. I implemented a chemical inventory system using markers that would reveal unauthorized access. The food storage area was secured with a combination lock, with only Sarah Henderson and myself knowing the code. These measures created resentment, but the alternative was potential starvation. The nights were the worst. As temperatures dropped to 50 below zero after sunset, we consolidated into the central distillery room where the insulation was strongest. 12 people sleeping in a space designed for industrial equipment, our breath forming ice crystals in the air. Privacy became a distant memory, human bodies packed together for warmth, personal boundaries erased by necessity. I slept little, constantly monitoring our heat sources and checking the chemical reactions that kept the temperature survivable. Often, I would find Jack Henderson awake as well, his frostbitten hands paining him too much for sleep. We talked quietly about engineering, problems, about mechanical solutions to our most pressing issues. His practical knowledge complemented my theoretical understanding, and together we developed several innovations that improved our situation marginally. The radio became our tenuous connection to the larger world. Each evening, I would spend an hour communicating with other survivor groups across what remained of the communications network. Most were in worse condition than we were. A family trapped in a suburban home described watching their neighbors freeze one by one as heating options failed. A military unit stranded at a rural outpost reported losing 3 men to a failed scavenging expedition. A medical clinic in a small town had become a morgue, the doctor performing autopsies to confirm what they already knew. Human physiology was not designed for such extreme cold. The voice on the radio mentioned rumors of cannibalism in isolated communities where food had run out. At the time, I thought it was hysteria. I had not yet seen what true hunger does to people. By day 35, I could no longer ignore the discrepancies in our supply inventory. Someone was taking extra food, potentially endangering everyone. I needed to identify the culprit without destroying the fragile trust that held our community together. I began by implementing chemical tests to track consumption, placing nearly invisible markers on certain containers that would reveal handling. The results confirmed my suspicions but provided no clear culprit. Multiple food containers showed evidence of unauthorized access. Either several people were taking supplies, or one person was clever enough to access different storage areas. The situation required more direct intervention. I called a community meeting, explaining our accelerated supply depletion without accusing anyone specifically. The reactions were telling. The Mitchells immediately suggested the college students were responsible. Marcus accused me of hiding additional supplies for myself. Sarah Henderson quietly watched everyone, her eyes calculating. Frank suggested setting a trap to catch the thief in action. That night, I prepared a special container of preserved fruit, marked with a chemical that would stain the hands of anyone who touched it. The stain would be invisible in normal light, but would glow under the specific wavelength of a laboratory lamp I possessed. It was a non-lethal, scientific approach to a human problem. In the morning, I examined everyone's hands under the pretext of checking for frostbite symptoms. Marcus, the perpetually questioning college student, showed the telltale glow on his right palm and fingertips. When confronted privately, he initially denied everything, then broke down in tearful confession. He had been hoarding food in a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards of the storage room. Not for himself alone, but for him and Lily to take when they executed their plan to strike out for the rumored government evacuation point 100 miles south. He was convinced I was leading everyone to a slow death by starvation, and that their only hope was to take supplies and attempt the journey despite the extreme conditions. The question of punishment created the first true division in our group. The Mitchells and Frank demanded severe consequences, suggesting banishment, which in these conditions would be equivalent to execution. Ellen and Karen argued for mercy, pointing out that Marcus was barely 22 and acting out of misguided protection for his friend. The Hendersons remained quiet, but I noticed Sarah watching the proceedings with particular attention to how I would handle the crisis. I had spent years measuring precise amounts of ingredients, but now I was measuring a man's worth against our collective survival. No formula existed for that calculation. Eventually, I decided on a compromise. Marcus would surrender all hidden. Supplies would be restricted from any food handling duties, and would work additional shifts on the most difficult tasks as restitution. It was harsh but fell short of the death sentence that banishment would represent. Not everyone was satisfied. Frank and Mr. Mitchell argued that the punishment created dangerous precedent. Their dissatisfaction created a faction within our already stressed community. Marcus became an outcast within our small group, speaking only to Lily and Karen, who had advocated for him. 3 nights later, the true cost of my decision became apparent. I awoke to Ellen shaking me urgently, whispering that Marcus and Lily were missing, along with a significant portion of our medical supplies and portable heat sources. They had fled, taking advantage of a brief lull in the snowstorms. We organized a search party immediately, despite the risks. Frank, Jack Henderson, and I followed their tracks through the snow, visible under our emergency lamps. The temperature was 45 below zero, with wind chill taking it close to 70 below. Even with our chemical heat packs and insulated clothing, we could only safely search for 30 minutes before risking severe frostbite. We found their backpack half a mile from the compound, dropped during what appeared to be a struggle based on the disturbed snow. Around it, wolf tracks circled and converged. There was blood on the snow, frozen into black crystals. No bodies, no further human tracks. The wolves had been quicker than the cold. I told myself they had chosen their fate by leaving the relative safety of our shelter, that their theft of crucial supplies had endangered everyone else, that in this new world justice looked different. But as we returned to the laboratory empty-handed except for the recovered backpack, I knew I would hear their voices in my dreams. The atmosphere in our shelter changed after Marcus and Lily's disappearance. Fear replaced tension, a cold calculation entering everyone's interactions. If two young, relatively healthy people could not survive even a mile in the outside environment, our situation was more precarious than many had allowed themselves to believe. The radio brought worse news daily. The global temperature continued to drop as volcanic ash reflected more solar radiation away from Earth. Scientific outposts in Antarctica reported unprecedented readings, weather patterns that had never been documented in human history. Government broadcasts became infrequent, then stopped entirely for several days, returning with obviously scripted reassurances that evacuation efforts continued. Even my military-grade thermometer stopped working as the temperature dropped beyond its designed range. When I poured water into a heated pan, it froze before hitting the bottom. The laws of physics seemed to be breaking alongside human law. We gathered around the radio each evening, hoping for news of improvement, for any sign that this catastrophic cooling might be temporary. Instead, we heard fewer voices each night as other survivor groups went silent, their fates unknown but easily imagined. The voice that brought us the most valuable information belonged to a former meteorologist broadcasting from a university weather station 100 miles east. He had access to satellite data that showed the extent of the freeze, the inexorable advance of ice sheets across the northern continents. He spoke of coastlines changing as oceans began to freeze, of entire cities becoming uninhabitable as infrastructure failed completely. His last broadcast ended mid-sentence. We never heard from him again. By day 40, I realized we needed to make significant changes to survive. Our current consumption rate would deplete critical supplies within 2 weeks. The cold showed no signs of abating. If anything, external temperatures were still dropping incrementally each day. We needed a new approach, a scientific solution to an extinction-level threat. I gathered our group and explained my proposal. We would convert the entire distillation system to focus on creating concentrated ethanol as a heat and energy source. This would require sacrificing some food stocks for fermentation, a risk I believed necessary to prevent freezing to death before starvation became our primary concern. The debate was intense but briefer than I expected. The reality of our situation had become impossible to deny. Even the Mitchells, who had opposed most of my previous decisions, voted in favor of the plan. Karen and I would work around the clock to implement the conversion, teaching others specific tasks to maintain the system once established. As we dismantled equipment and rebuilt it for our survival needs, I found myself thinking of Eliza. My daughter had accused me of choosing isolation over connection, science over humanity. Yet here I was, using every bit of scientific knowledge I possessed to keep these 11 people alive. I wondered if she would see the irony, if she was still alive to see anything at all. The conversion to our new system was nearly complete when disaster struck from an unexpected direction. Sarah Henderson, who had been absolutely reliable since their arrival, collapsed while carrying wood for the still furnace. Her skin burned with fever despite the cold air. The symptoms progressed rapidly: difficulty breathing, severe cough, disorientation. Pneumonia, Ellen diagnosed, likely developing for days before becoming acute. In our weakened, crowded conditions, infection had found the perfect breeding ground, and we had given away many of our medical supplies when Marcus and Lily fled. I knew my emergency medical training was not enough to save her if the infection continued to worsen. What I did not know was that salvation was walking toward us through the storm, carrying secrets that would change everything. As I watched, Ellen treating Sarah with our limited supplies, the perimeter alarm sounded, signaling movement outside our compound. Someone or something had found us. Frank was on watch when the perimeter alarm sounded. He rushed inside, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air, to report movement at the tree line north of the laboratory. After the incident with the wolves, we had established strict security protocols. Jack Henderson and I grabbed our weapons and thermal coverings while the others moved to the secure room we had designated for emergencies. The storm had temporarily subsided, leaving an eerie stillness in the crystalline air. Visibility was unusually good, the moonlight reflecting off the unbroken snow with blinding intensity. Through my binoculars, I spotted a dark figure struggling through the snow toward our compound. A single person, moving with the deliberate, exhausted gait of someone at the limits of their endurance. Not a threat then, but a survivor. Still, caution was necessary. We had no way of knowing if this person might bring danger to our fragile community, either through infection, mental instability, or outside connections. We approached carefully, weapons visible but not aimed. The figure collapsed about 50 yards from our perimeter. Against Frank's objections, I moved forward to investigate. As I drew closer, I could see it was a man, his cold weather gear of professional quality but damaged by what must have been weeks of harsh travel. He was unconscious but still breathing, his respirations shallow and rapid. We carried him inside, setting up an isolation area as Ellen assessed his condition. Severe hypothermia, dehydration, and frostbite on his right ear and several fingers. We began warming him gradually, using the alcohol baths I had developed for such emergencies. As his core temperature rose, he began to murmur deliriously, mentioning quarantine protocols and containment failures at something called Camp Refuge. When he regained consciousness hours later, he identified himself as Dr. James Wheeler, a virologist with the Centers for Disease Control. He had been stationed at an emergency response center in Tennessee when communications failed. His team had sent him north with critical information and supplies, traveling on foot when their vehicle became disabled. Most of his supplies had been stolen by desperate survivors he encountered on his journey. His satellite phone was damaged but still partially functional. Most importantly, he carried with him something I had not seen in weeks: hope. Dr. Wheeler became our 13th member, and his medical knowledge immediately proved invaluable. He worked with Ellen to properly treat Sarah Henderson's pneumonia, using antibiotics he had carried in a waterproof case inside his clothing. He confirmed my suspicions about infection risks in our crowded conditions and helped implement improved hygiene protocols despite our limited water supply. During his more lucid periods, Wheeler shared information about the government response to the freeze. The news was not encouraging. The southern states had been overwhelmed by northern refugees, leading to resource conflicts and eventual border closures enforced by state National Guard units. The federal government had established emergency zones where critical infrastructure was maintained through massive fuel expenditure, but these zones were reaching capacity limits. He described camps where thousands of people were housed in hastily converted warehouses and sports arenas, dependent on dwindling fuel supplies for heat. Disease was spreading through these facilities despite quarantine efforts. The CDC had been working around the clock to prepare for epidemics they knew would follow the initial disaster. Wheeler had been traveling to a CDC auxiliary facility in northern Minnesota, where specialized equipment had been stored for pandemic response scenarios. His knowledge of my distillery operations came from a government database of facilities with potential for medical supply production. He believed my equipment and expertise could be adapted to produce essential compounds for disease treatment. But there was something in his manner when discussing the southern camps that troubled me. A hesitation, a calculated omission. As a military veteran, I recognized the signs of someone following compartmentalized information protocols. Wheeler was sharing what he was authorized to share, but holding back critical details. My suspicions were confirmed one night during his fevered sleep. Wheeler called out warnings about containment breaches and mutation rates, about something in the meltwater. The next morning I confronted him privately, making it clear that in our situation, full disclosure might mean the difference between life and death for everyone. Wheeler hesitated, then showed me his satellite phone. The battery was nearly depleted, but he accessed a protected file containing photographs and data from the southern camps. What I saw changed my understanding of our situation completely. The government evacuation centers were experiencing not just cold-related fatalities and common communicable diseases, but something far more concerning. A pathogen that appeared to thrive in the extreme cold conditions was causing symptoms unlike anything previously documented. Wheeler's team had preliminary evidence suggesting it might have been dormant in Arctic ice for millennia, released as permafrost melted during the years before the freeze. The most disturbing aspect was that the CDC had no effective treatment protocol yet. Wheeler's journey north was partially to reach equipment that might help develop countermeasures, but also to establish remote research, outposts away from population centers where the pathogen was spreading rapidly. I asked why he hadn't shared this information with our entire group. His answer was pragmatic. Panic would not improve our chances of survival. The pathogen had not yet reached our area based on his testing of our water sources. For now, we faced only the immediate threats of cold, starvation, and conventional infections. Wheeler also showed me something else on his phone that struck me like a physical blow. A personnel manifest from one of the Western evacuation centers included the name Eliza Kellerman, listed as an agricultural specialist assisting with emergency food production systems. My daughter was potentially alive, working at a facility in Montana. The knowledge changed everything for me. Until that moment, I had been focused solely on immediate survival, on keeping my small group alive through the unending winter. Now, I had a longer-term purpose: to reach the CDC facility, help develop responses to both the freeze and the emerging pathogen, and potentially find my way to Eliza. But our situation deteriorated before we could formulate a plan. 2 days after Wheeler's arrival, our primary generator failed catastrophically during the worst storm we had yet experienced. The mechanical breakdown occurred in a section that Jack Henderson couldn't repair without specialized parts. Our electrical systems, already operating at minimal capacity, shut down completely. We evacuated to the central distillery room, the only space we could heat adequately with our remaining resources. 13 people crowded into a room designed for industrial equipment, every breath visible in the rapidly cooling air. Our chemical heat sources became our only barrier against freezing to death. I immediately implemented emergency protocols, converting every available organic material to alcohol production for fuel and heat. Wheeler helped calculate the most efficient use of our resources, while Karen assisted with the chemical processes. Outside, the storm raged with unprecedented fury, temperatures dropping to 70 below zero. Using alcohol as an emergency fuel source was dangerous in our enclosed space. The risk of fire or carbon monoxide poisoning had to be balanced against certain freezing without adequate heat. We established a rotation of monitors to check oxygen levels and maintain ventilation, despite the heat loss it caused. The emergency brought an unexpected moment of unity to our fractured group. Even the Mitchells, who had been increasingly difficult as their health declined, worked without complaint at their assigned tasks. Frank, whose distrust of Wheeler had been obvious, collaborated with the doctor on insulating our sleeping areas with every available material. On the second night of the storm, Sarah Henderson's condition worsened again. The stress of the evacuation had exacerbated her pneumonia, and our medical supplies were running dangerously low. Ellen and Wheeler worked continuously to stabilize her, using techniques developed in field hospitals during previous disasters. Jack Henderson watched helplessly as his wife struggled for each breath, his frost-bitten hands preventing him from assisting with her care. Their children, Jake and his sister Emma, huddled nearby, their small faces solemn with a comprehension beyond their years. They had already seen too much death to be shielded from the possibility of losing their mother. In desperation, I turned to my most experimental knowledge, techniques for extracting compounds from plant materials that I had researched but never implemented commercially. Using the last of our specialized laboratory equipment, I worked through the night to create a concentrated extract from pine needles gathered during previous foraging trips. The vitamin C and other compounds might support Sarah's immune response, a supplemental treatment when conventional options were exhausted. The chemical fire nearly killed us all. A volatile reaction between alcohol vapors and one of the compounds I was using ignited explosively, sending flames across the laboratory table. Karen's quick action with the emergency suppressant prevented the fire from spreading, but not before it consumed something far more valuable than the equipment: our future. Every jar of preserved food stored in that section of the laboratory was destroyed. Every medicine vial, every fuel canister, every carefully hoarded resource that represented our long-term survival. The flames gave heat, but they took something more precious: hope. In the aftermath, I conducted a grim inventory of our remaining supplies. The calculations were undeniable. We had approximately 10 days of critical supplies remaining, with no prospect of replenishment. Even with maximum rationing, we would face terminal shortages before the winter showed any signs of abating. I shared this assessment with Wheeler and Karen first, wanting their scientific verification, before presenting the situation to the entire group. Wheeler studied my figures silently, then revealed something he had kept from me. His satellite phone contained downloaded maps and data about the CDC auxiliary facility. It was closer than I had realized, perhaps a 3-day journey in normal conditions. In our current situation, with the extreme temperatures and limited mobility, it might take 5 to 7 days. The facility was designed to be self-sufficient, with geothermal, heating systems, stored supplies, and specialized equipment. If we could reach it, our survival chances increased dramatically. But the journey itself would claim lives given our weakened condition and the unrelenting cold. Karen argued that splitting our resources between those who stayed and those who made the attempt would doom both groups. Wheeler countered that remaining guaranteed everyone's death when supplies ran out. The debate continued until we realized a more immediate problem demanded attention. Sarah Henderson had developed a high fever that our remaining medications couldn't control. Wheeler's demeanor changed then. The professional caution he had maintained gave way to urgent focus. He explained that Sarah's worsening condition might indicate secondary infection with more resistant pathogens. Without intervention, sepsis would develop within hours. He revealed another secret. Hidden in the lining of his cold weather gear were emergency antibiotics, a last resort supply he had been instructed to use only in critical circumstances. The doses were limited, but might be sufficient to treat Sarah's infection if we acted immediately. As Ellen administered the medication, Wheeler pulled me aside for a private conversation. He explained that his journey north had a more specific purpose than he had initially revealed. The CDC had developed protocols for using ethanol of specific proof to extract compounds from surviving plants for new antibiotics. My distillery skills were not just generally useful, but specifically required for this process. Furthermore, he had not been completely honest about seeing Eliza's name in the evacuation records. He had actually spoken with her briefly via emergency communication channels before leaving Tennessee. She had asked about me specifically, having learned I might be in the path of the most severe temperature drops. This revelation hit me with physical force. My daughter, whom I had not spoken to in months before the disaster, had been concerned for my welfare, had tried to find information about my situation. The emotional impact was almost overwhelming after weeks of focusing solely on survival. While Sarah Henderson received treatment, I called a meeting of our remaining adults to discuss our options. The fire had changed everything. Our previously sustainable situation had become terminal. We needed to make an impossible choice: attempt a dangerous journey to an uncertain destination, or remain in our failing shelter until supplies ran out completely. The debate was heated despite the freezing temperatures. Frank and Mr. Mitchell argued vehemently against leaving, pointing out that we had no guarantees the CDC facility was still operational or accessible. The risk of dying exposed in the wilderness seemed more terrible than a quicker end in relative shelter. Ellen supported the attempt, noting that Sarah's condition required more advanced medical care than we could provide with our remaining supplies. Karen calculated that if we divided resources appropriately, a smaller group making the journey would have adequate supplies, while leaving enough for those who stayed to survive until potential help arrived. Jack Henderson, whose opinion carried significant weight due to his practical knowledge, remained silent throughout the discussion, his attention focused on his recovering wife. When finally asked directly, he spoke with quiet certainty. "We've been dying slowly since the day this began. I'd rather risk dying quickly while moving toward something better." Wheeler provided the technical details that tipped the balance. The CDC facility had been designed for worst-case scenarios, including nuclear winter and extreme climate events. Its geothermal heating system required no external power. Its supply caches included medications, long-term food stores, and equipment for producing essentials. Most importantly, it had communication capabilities that might allow contact with other surviving government installations. I made the final decision as the reluctant leader our group had accepted. We would divide into 2 teams. One would attempt the journey to the CDC facility. The other would remain at the laboratory with the majority of the remaining supplies. If the traveling team reached the destination successfully, they would send help back immediately. The division would be based on capability and necessity. Wheeler, with his CDC clearance and medical knowledge, would lead the traveling group. I would go, carrying critical distillation knowledge. Jack Henderson, despite his injured hands, volunteered immediately, unwilling to be separated from his wife, who needed ongoing medical care. Ellen would accompany us to monitor Sarah's condition during transport. The remaining group would include the Mitchells, whose age made the journey too risky, Frank, who would maintain security, Karen, who could continue limited chemical production, and the Henderson children, who would be safer remaining in shelter than risking exposure. The last stipulation created the only true conflict in our planning. Jack Henderson refused to leave his children behind, despite the obvious dangers of bringing them on our desperate journey. After heated discussion, we reached a compromise. Jake, the 5-year-old boy, would remain at the laboratory where conditions were more controlled. Emma, the 7-year-old girl, would travel with her parents, as separating a child from both parents seemed unnecessarily traumatic. As we prepared for departure, gathering the portable distillation equipment Wheeler deemed essential and creating concentrated fuel sources for the journey, I discovered a critical problem. The specialized GPS device we needed for navigation was missing from its storage location. Without it, finding the CDC facility in the featureless frozen landscape would be nearly impossible. A thorough search yielded nothing. The device had been present during inventory just 2 days earlier. Someone had taken it deliberately. I gathered everyone for an emergency meeting, emphasizing that without the navigation equipment, the journey could not proceed. The silence that followed my announcement was broken by Sarah Henderson's weak voice from her medical cot. "I took it," she admitted, her fever-bright eyes holding no remorse. "I destroyed it last night while everyone was sleeping." Her explanation sent a chill through the room colder than the outside air. "If some leave, we all die," she whispered. "Better to keep the group together than let half freeze in the wilderness." The cold had changed her more than any of us realized. Fear had driven her to sabotage our chance at survival. Jack Henderson stared at his wife in shocked disbelief. Wheeler quickly assessed the situation with clinical detachment, asking if the device was truly destroyed or merely hidden. Sarah's response was to produce a handful of crushed circuitry from beneath her blanket. The sophisticated navigation system was beyond repair. Our fragile plan collapsed as quickly as it had formed. Without precise navigation, the journey became a suicide mission. The featureless, snow-covered landscape provided few landmarks, and, in whiteout conditions, maintaining direction was impossible without specialized equipment. Wheeler withdrew to review his satellite phone data, searching for alternatives. The battery was nearly depleted, allowing only minutes of operation. Jack Henderson sat beside his wife, his expression unreadable as she drifted between fever-induced delirium and moments of clarity in which she begged his forgiveness. As I watched this family drama unfold against the backdrop of our collective Crisis, I realized how profoundly the extreme cold had affected not just our physical environment, but our psychological landscape. We were all making decisions based on fear, on the primal instinct for immediate survival rather than longer-term thinking. That night, as temperatures outside reached 75 below zero and the storm intensified again, Wheeler approached me with a new proposal. His satellite phone contained basic topographical maps that, while not as precise as the GPS system, might be sufficient if combined with compass navigation and natural landmarks. The journey would be riskier, the margin for error much smaller, but not impossible. More importantly, he revealed that the CDC facility contained equipment that could potentially help address the emerging pathogen he had previously described. If we failed to reach it, the threat might spread beyond containment as spring eventually arrived and survivors began to migrate. I asked why he had withheld this information during our group discussion. His answer was troubling. He had been operating under classified protocols that limited information sharing based on security clearance. The extreme circumstances had finally convinced him that adherence to pre-disaster regulations might cost humanity its last chance at organized recovery. As the storm howled outside and our group slept fitfully in the increasingly cold laboratory, Wheeler and I formulated a new plan. We would proceed with a smaller team, just Wheeler, myself, and anyone who volunteered with full understanding of the increased risks. We would take minimal supplies to maximize travel speed and navigate using the limited maps available. The decision weighed heavily on me. As a distiller, I had always measured ingredients precisely, controlled temperatures exactly, managed every variable in my processes. This journey would be the opposite of that controlled environment, a desperate gamble against incalculable odds. But the alternative was equally certain, a slow death as supplies dwindled and temperatures remained lethal. As I finally fell into exhausted sleep, my dreams were filled with images of Eliza. Not as the angry young woman who had last confronted me about my isolated lifestyle, but as the curious child who had once helped me measure grain for mash, her small hands learning the patience required for fermentation. I wondered if I would ever see her again, if this desperate journey would lead me back to family, or simply to a different kind of end. The morning brought unexpected clarity. The storm had briefly subsided, leaving a crystalline landscape visible through our frost-covered windows, and with it came a decision from an unexpected source that would change everything. Jake Henderson, the 5-year-old boy who had been nearly silent since his arrival at the laboratory, approached me during the morning meal distribution. "I want to go with you and Dad," he said simply, his small face serious beyond his years. "Mom needs doctors, and Dad needs me." The child's unexpected decision created a new variable in our desperate calculations. A journey that might claim adult lives would be even more dangerous for a child. Yet the emotional equation had shifted as well. Jack Henderson's torn loyalty between his wife and his children might find resolution if both children remained together. As our small group prepared for what might be our final day of relative safety, the choices we faced were impossible by any normal standard. But normality had frozen to death weeks ago. What remained was simply survival, and the hope that something more might exist beyond the killing cold that had become our world. Our final meeting before departure became unexpectedly contentious. Wheeler presented his plan to the entire group, explaining the crucial nature of reaching the CDC facility, both for our immediate survival and for addressing the larger threats facing survivors everywhere. He carefully avoided mentioning the pathogen directly, framing it as a matter of accessing essential medical supplies and communications equipment. Frank immediately voiced opposition, arguing that Wheeler's real motivation was abandoning those who couldn't travel to save himself. The accusation hung in the frigid air as Wheeler maintained his professional composure, explaining that his mission parameters included bringing back help for anyone left behind at functioning outposts. The Mitchells supported Frank's position, though likely for different reasons. Their declining health made remaining our only viable option for them, and human nature made them want everyone else to stay as well. Karen remained neutral, acknowledging the logic in both arguments while focusing on practical matters of resource division. Jack Henderson's decision carried significant influence. After speaking privately with Sarah, whose fever had finally broken under Wheeler's treatment, he announced that he, Sarah, and both children would attempt the journey. "We stay together," he said simply, "as a family." The statement silenced the room. Even Frank seemed to recognize the weight of a father choosing potential death together over safer separation. Wheeler quickly adapted his plans to accommodate the additional travelers, recalculating supply requirements and transport options. I spent that day constructing improvised sleds from laboratory equipment and distillery parts. Our transportation would be entirely human-powered, each adult pulling a sled containing supplies and, in Jack's case, his still-recovering wife. The children would walk when possible, but would need to ride during difficult terrain or when fatigue became dangerous. Wheeler worked with Ellen to prepare medical kits optimized for travel, focusing on treatments for frostbite, hypothermia, and Sarah's continuing recovery. He also prepared emergency stimulants and pain management options that he had not previously revealed from his personal supplies. Karen helped me create specialized chemical heat sources for the journey. We developed compact packets that would generate intense heat when activated, designed to be carried close to the body to maintain core temperature. The chemistry was precise, unstable, potentially dangerous, but essential for survival in the extreme conditions we would face. The most difficult part of preparation was dividing our remaining food supplies. Those staying behind would need sufficient resources to survive until potential help arrived. Yet those traveling required enough calories to sustain the intense physical exertion of the journey. After multiple calculations, we settled on a division that left both groups with approximately 10 days of survival, assuming strict rationing. Frank made his final decision as we packed the sleds. He would remain at the laboratory with the Mitchells and Karen, maintaining what remained of our shelter and continuing limited communications attempts via the shortwave radio. His expertise in local geography had been rendered largely useless by the transformed landscape, where familiar landmarks lay buried under meters of snow and ice. Our departure was scheduled for dawn the following day to maximize the limited daylight for our first and potentially most crucial leg of the journey. That final night in the relative safety of the laboratory was somber. Everyone understood that we might never see each other again, that both groups faced nearly impossible odds of survival. Ellen chose to remain behind as well, a last-minute decision based on her assessment that the Mitchells would require medical monitoring that Karen could not provide while maintaining the critical chemical systems. Her choice meant our traveling party would have no dedicated medical professional, but Wheeler's training would have to suffice. I slept little that night, reviewing Wheeler's maps and memorizing key landmarks and compass bearings in case his satellite phone failed completely. The journey would take us northwest approximately 40 miles through terrain that had been forest and farmland before the freeze. Now it would be an unrecognizable landscape of snow and ice with few features to guide navigation. Before first light, we made final preparations in near silence. The temperature outside registered 68 below zero with minimal wind, relatively favorable conditions for our departure. Wheeler, Jack Henderson, Sarah on her sled, and the 2 Henderson children comprised our traveling party. We carried the critical distillation equipment Wheeler deemed essential: concentrated food rations, chemical heat sources, and minimal extra clothing, since additional layers would compromise mobility more than provide meaningful additional protection. Our goodbye to the remaining group was brief. Extended farewells would only make the separation more difficult and waste precious daylight. Frank shook my hand with surprising strength, whispering, "Bring back help if you can. I will keep them alive until then." As we pushed open the laboratory door for the first time in weeks, the cold hit us with physical force. Even through our layered protection, the intensity of it took my breath away. The children gasped simultaneously, their exhaled breath crystallizing instantly in the air before them. The snow had a strange consistency, more like fine sand than the wet snow of normal winters. It squeaked beneath our boots as we began pulling our sleds away from the laboratory. I looked back once to see Frank standing in the doorway, his figure already seeming small and distant against the vastness of the white landscape stretching in all directions. The first hour passed in relative silence, each of us focused on establishing a sustainable pace and adjusting to the physical demands of travel. Wheeler led our single-file procession, using his compass to maintain our heading. I followed, pulling the sled with our equipment. Jack came next, pulling Sarah's sled with practiced movements that suggested his mechanical background had prepared him well for the rhythmic exertion. The children walked behind their parents, Emma helping Jake when the snow depth challenged his shorter legs. Wheeler had calculated we needed to cover approximately 8 miles per day to reach the facility within our supply limitations. Under normal conditions, this would be easily achievable. In the extreme cold, pulling heavy sleds through deep snow, it represented an enormous challenge. By midday, we had traveled perhaps 3 miles. The children were showing signs of fatigue, despite their determined efforts. We activated chemical heat packs and distributed a minimal food ration, careful to avoid excessive cooling from stopped movement. Sarah Henderson remained alert on her sled, her medical condition seemingly stabilized, though far from fully recovered. Wheeler checked his satellite phone briefly, confirming our position against his downloaded maps before powering it down to conserve the failing battery. His expression revealed little, but I had learned to read the subtle indicators of concern in his professional demeanor. Something about our progress or position troubled him. When we resumed travel, he dropped back to speak with me quietly, out of earshot of the others. "The temperature is dropping again," he said simply. "We're moving, slower than calculated. At this rate, we'll need to find shelter before nightfall rather than continuing through darkness as planned." The implications were significant. Any delay would strain our supply calculations, but continuing after dark in deteriorating conditions would risk fatal errors in navigation or physical collapse from exposure. I nodded acknowledgement and we pressed on without alarming the others. By mid-afternoon, the quality of light began to change, not just from the advancing hour but from increasing atmospheric ice crystals that created an optical phenomenon I had never witnessed before. Hollows and sundogs surrounded the weak sun, casting rainbow refractions across the snow. Under different circumstances, it might have been beautiful. Now it signaled worsening conditions and potentially another approaching storm. Wheeler called a halt at what appeared to be a small rise in the otherwise featureless terrain. Using specialized tools, we began excavating a snow shelter, creating a small cave in the hard-packed drift. The children watched wide-eyed as the structure took shape, Jake offering suggestions based on survival techniques he had apparently learned from books before the disaster. The snow shelter, properly constructed, would maintain temperature far better than any tent or artificial structure we could have carried. The principles were simple. The small entrance tunnel would prevent warm air from escaping. Our body heat would be contained by the insulating snow walls, and the domed ceiling would prevent meltwater from dripping onto us. As darkness fell, we crowded into the completed shelter, arranging our bodies to maximize warmth while maintaining access to supplies. The contrast between the killing cold outside and the relative protection of our snow cave was remarkable. Without external heat sources, using only our combined body heat and minimal chemical assistance, the interior temperature rose to just below freezing, a full 60 degrees warmer than the external environment. Sarah Henderson's condition concerned me during that first night. Her breathing became labored in the enclosed space, and Wheeler administered additional medication from his dwindling supply. Jack held her hand continuously, speaking quietly to her during her periods of consciousness, his voice maintaining a reassuring tone that belied the fear evident in his eyes. The children fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the day's exertion. Emma curled protectively around her younger brother, their small bodies generating surprising heat. Wheeler maintained watch during the first shift, monitoring both the weather conditions and Sarah's medical status. I tried to rest, knowing my turn for watch would come, but sleep proved elusive. My thoughts turned to Eliza, to the possibility that this desperate journey might eventually lead me to her. I wondered what she would think of my choices since the freeze began, whether she would recognize the person I had become under the pressure of keeping others alive. The father she had known was methodical, controlled, isolated by choice. The man I had become made life or death decisions daily, led others despite my preference for solitude, and now risked everything on an uncertain journey. When Wheeler woke me for my watch shift, his whispered assessment was grim. Temperature continuing to drop. Storm system approaching from the west based on pressure changes. Sarah's respiratory function declining again. I moved to check our supplies while the others slept, calculating and recalculating our remaining resources against the distance still to cover. The margins were shrinking with each passing hour. Any significant delay or detour would push us beyond survivable limits. Morning brought a fresh challenge. The entrance to our snow shelter had partially collapsed during the night, requiring careful excavation to avoid a complete structural failure. The sky outside was a strange copper color, the air filled with ice particles that reduced visibility to less than 100 yards. Wheeler consulted his compass and satellite phone, the latter powered up just long enough to confirm our position and the approaching weather system. "We need to move immediately," he announced. "We have perhaps 2 hours before the storm front arrives. If we're caught in open terrain, our survival probability drops significantly." We broke camp with practiced efficiency, each person understanding the urgency without requiring detailed explanation. The Henderson children, despite their age, worked without complaint, helping to secure equipment on the sleds and preparing themselves for the day's journey. As we emerged onto the open snowfield, I noticed Wheeler studying the horizon with unusual intensity. Following his gaze, I spotted what had captured his attention: a thin column of smoke rising against the copper sky, perhaps 2 miles east of our position. The implications were immediately clear to both of us. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant human presence. Human presence in these conditions could represent either salvation or significant danger. Wheeler gestured me aside for a quick conference, speaking just beyond the Henderson family's hearing. "We maintain course," he said firmly. "Unknown human contact represents unacceptable risk variables." I countered with practical concerns. The storm approaches from the west. Moving east temporarily might allow us to weather it in better conditions than another snow cave. And they might have communications equipment, medical supplies. Or they might have weapons, territorial imperatives, and insufficient resources to share. Wheeler replied, his background in disaster response evident in his rapid assessment. Population behavior patterns in extreme survival scenarios typically degrade to protective tribalism. The smoke column is too small for a well-equipped outpost. Most likely scenario is desperate survivors with minimal resources. Jack Henderson joined our hurried discussion, having overheard enough to understand the choice before us. "Sarah needs real shelter," he said simply. "The children too. A proper fire would make the difference." The decision weighed heavily. Every calculation we had made assumed continuing directly toward the CDC facility, without deviation. Yet human survival had always depended on adaptability, on responding to changing conditions rather than rigid adherence to initial plans. A strange howling sound from the western horizon decided the matter. The approaching storm was advancing faster than predicted, a wall of white already visible in the distance. We adjusted our course eastward toward the smoke column, moving as rapidly as possible across the increasingly difficult terrain. As we drew closer to the source of the smoke, Wheeler signaled a stop and surveyed the area through his specialized optical equipment. His report was concise. Small structure, likely pre-existing hunting cabin. Heat signature indicates approximately 3 to 4 occupants. No visible weapons or defensive perimeter, but approach remains high risk. We decided that Wheeler and I would approach initially, leaving Jack with his family in a defensible position with supplies and weapons. If the occupants proved hostile, the Hendersons would have warning and opportunity to retreat. As we neared the structure, the dilapidated condition became apparent. Once a modest hunting cabin, it now stood partially collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow. The smoke emerged from an improvised chimney constructed from what appeared to be vehicle parts. No movement was visible from outside, though the structure clearly contained occupants based on the heat indicators. Wheeler signaled our approach, calling out in the formal tones of government authority rather than as fellow survivors. The response was immediate and unexpected. The cabin door burst open, and 3 figures emerged with raised weapons, their faces obscured by cold weather gear, but their military stance unmistakable. "Federal agents," the central figure announced. "Identify yourselves and state your purpose." Wheeler immediately produced his CDC identification, holding it visible despite the degrading weather conditions. Dr. James Wheeler, Centers for Disease Control. On official transit to Auxiliary Facility designation MN17 with essential personnel and civilians. A tense moment followed as the armed figures conferred briefly. Then the leader lowered his weapon and approached. "Captain Robert Allen, Department of Homeland Security. We diverted from evacuation duty when our vehicle failed. Been stranded here for 9 days." The convergence was extraordinarily fortunate. Captain Allen's team had been escorting critical personnel to government facilities when mechanical failures forced them to seek shelter. They had maintained their vehicle's radio equipment, which provided more recent information than Wheeler had access to through his failing satellite phone. Their news was mixed. The national situation continued to deteriorate, with infrastructure collapse now complete across most of the Northern Hemisphere. Government functions had been consolidated to a few key facilities, primarily in southern regions where temperatures remained survivable with massive energy expenditure. Most concerning, the pathogen Wheeler had mentioned previously was now confirmed in multiple evacuation centers, with quarantine protocols failing due to overcrowding and resource limitations. However, they confirmed the CDC auxiliary facility remained operational based on automated status transmissions received 3 days earlier. Its geothermal systems continued functioning, and the security protocols remained intact. Most importantly, they had detailed maps and navigation equipment that dramatically improved our chances of reaching the destination. Captain Allen's team had been conserving their remaining supplies while attempting to repair their communication equipment to request extraction. With the approaching storm, they had been preparing to abandon the failing structure and attempt travel to the nearest known government outpost, which happened to be the same CDC facility we were targeting. The convergence of our groups created new possibilities and complications. Their tactical expertise and equipment improved our survival probability significantly. However, additional personnel meant faster consumption of limited supplies. After brief negotiation, we agreed to combine forces, pooling resources, and continuing together once the approaching storm passed. Jack Henderson returned to retrieve Sarah and the children, bringing them to the relative shelter of the cabin just as the storm front arrived with full force. The structure shuddered under the impact of wind-driven ice particles, the improvised repairs barely maintaining structural integrity against the onslaught. Inside, conditions were primitive but significantly better than our snow shelter would have been. The federal agents had created an efficient heating system using parts from their disabled vehicle and found fuel sources, maintaining an interior temperature that, while still below freezing, would not cause immediate medical concerns. Sarah Henderson's condition stabilized somewhat in the improved environment. The federal medical officer, Agent Patel, had training comparable to Wheeler's, and a well-supplied emergency kit. Together they developed a treatment approach that addressed her respiratory infection more effectively than our limited resources had allowed. The children adapted to the new circumstances with remarkable resilience. Jake immediately began questioning the federal agents about their equipment and weaponry, his natural curiosity temporarily overcoming the trauma of our journey. Emma remained more reserved, staying close to her mother but watching everything with careful attention. Captain Allen shared his intelligence briefings with Wheeler and me while his team prepared a meal from their supplies. The information painted a grim picture of global conditions. The volcanic ash that had triggered the freeze showed no signs of dissipating. Government models projected at least 6 more months of extreme temperatures before even marginal improvement might begin. Worldwide, infrastructure failure had led to catastrophic casualty rates, with entire cities becoming uninhabitable as heating and water systems failed. Most concerning was the confirmation of Wheeler's earlier warning about the emerging pathogen. Federal agencies had classified the situation as a potential extinction-level event if containment failed completely. The cold had initially slowed transmission, but the concentration of survivors in evacuation centers created perfect conditions for rapid spread once the pathogen established presence. The CDC facility we were attempting to reach had taken on greater significance than I had initially understood. It contained specialized equipment for analyzing novel pathogens and developing treatment protocols that might be our last defense against this new threat. The storm intensified through the evening, the wind creating an otherworldly howling as it forced its way through the damaged structure. We took turns monitoring the integrity of our shelter, reinforcing weak points and maintaining the precious fire that stood between us and freezing deaths. During my watch shift, Captain Allen approached me privately, his manner suggesting information not shared with the broader group. "Dr. Wheeler indicated you have a daughter at the Western Evacuation Center," he said quietly. "I should inform you that communication with that facility has been intermittent for the past week. The last transmission indicated they were implementing emergency quarantine procedures." The implication was clear without requiring explicit statement. The pathogen had potentially reached the facility where Eliza worked. The knowledge added personal urgency to our mission beyond mere survival. Reaching the CDC facility might provide not just our salvation, but potentially help for my daughter and countless others facing this emerging threat. As the storm reached its peak intensity during the night, a loud crack resonated through the cabin as a supporting beam gave way under the accumulated snow load. Captain Allen's team responded with military precision, evacuating everyone to the most stable corner while attempting emergency repairs. Despite their efforts, it became clear the structure would not survive the night intact. We began preparing for emergency evacuation into the storm, a scenario with minimal survival probability but preferable to being crushed when the roof inevitably collapsed. Wheeler and Agent Patel rapidly packed critical medical supplies. Captain Allen's team secured navigation and communication equipment. Jack Henderson focused on preparing his family, particularly crafting additional protection for the children against the lethal conditions outside. I concentrated on salvaging the distillation equipment Wheeler had identified as essential, knowing its importance extended beyond our immediate survival to the larger mission of addressing the pathogen. The specialized copper components and precision instruments represented irreplaceable technology in our collapsed world. As we completed preparations, the structure groaned continuously, small failures cascading toward catastrophic collapse. Captain Allen gave the evacuation order, and we moved toward the door in predetermined sequence, each person understanding their responsibility in the chaotic transition to come. The moment before we opened the door to the killing storm, the sound of the wind changed pitch. The howling diminished, replaced by an eerie silence broken only by the continuing structural failures of our shelter. Agent Ramirez, tasked with monitoring weather conditions, reported an unexpected development. The storm had reached its peak intensity and was now dissipating as rapidly as it had arrived. The sudden change created a narrow window of opportunity. If we moved immediately, we might travel significantly farther before requiring shelter again. Captain Allen immediately revised our evacuation plan, transforming it from desperate survival to strategic advancement toward our objective. As the cabin's roof began a partial collapse, we executed our departure in the relative calm between storm systems. Outside, the landscape had been transformed yet again by the recent storm. New drifts created obstacles in unexpected locations, while previously difficult terrain had sometimes been smoothed by the redistribution of snow. Captain Allen took point position, using military-grade navigation equipment to establish our bearing with precision impossible under our previous circumstances. Wheeler and Agent Patel coordinated Sarah Henderson's transport, the improved medical supplies allowing her to travel with greater stability. Jack Henderson and I managed the children and equipment, establishing a sustainable pace that balanced progress against exhaustion. The sky above had cleared temporarily, revealing a strange, aurora-like phenomenon unlike anything in normal experience. The atmospheric changes from the volcanic ash created light effects that rippled across the heavens in toxic-looking greens and purples. Beautiful, but alien, a reminder that our world had fundamentally changed. As we established our traveling formation and began moving northwest again toward the CDC facility, I found myself between hope and dread. Our chances had improved significantly with the additional resources and expertise of Captain Allen's team. Yet the information they brought confirmed our worst fears about the broader situation and added the complication of the pathogen reaching Eliza's location. The cold remained our most immediate threat, with temperatures still hovering near 70, below zero even in the relative calm between storm systems. But for the first time since leaving the laboratory, reaching our destination seemed potentially achievable rather than merely necessary. Whether what we found there would offer salvation or simply a different kind of end remained to be seen. The calm between storm systems lasted approximately 6 hours, allowing us to cover nearly 10 miles before the weather began deteriorating again. Captain Allen's navigation equipment proved invaluable, compensating for the featureless terrain that had previously forced us to rely on Wheeler's less precise methods. We maintained a northwestern heading, the CDC facility now less than 30 miles distant according to our updated calculations. Our expanded group moved with surprising efficiency despite the additional personnel. The federal agents' wilderness training complemented our survival adaptations, and their equipment significantly improved our capabilities. Agent Patel continued monitoring Sarah Henderson's condition, which had stabilized but remained precarious for travel in such extreme conditions. The children demonstrated remarkable resilience. Emma had taken responsibility for her younger brother, helping him maintain pace and monitoring his condition with an awareness beyond her years. Jake remained curious despite the circumstances, questioning Captain Allen about military operations and survival techniques, with the insatiable interest of a child temporarily distracted from the horror surrounding him. Wheeler and I discussed the specific equipment we would need to access at the CDC facility, prioritizing both the immediate survival needs of our group and the broader mission of addressing the pathogen. His expertise in virology combined with my knowledge of distillation and chemical extraction processes would be crucial for producing the specialized compounds needed for analysis and potential treatment development. As the weather began to deteriorate again, Captain Allen identified a potential shelter location on his topographical maps. What had once been a maintenance building for a rural electrical substation might provide more substantial protection than another snow cave. The structure would be partially buried under accumulated snow, but might maintain structural integrity unlike the hunting cabin we had recently abandoned. Agent Ramirez took point. Position as we approach the coordinates, scanning for any signs of previous human presence that might indicate danger. The landscape showed no tracks or disturbances in the fresh snowfall, suggesting the location had remained unvisited since the freeze began. The maintenance building was barely visible, its roofline just emerging from a massive drift that had nearly engulfed the structure. Captain Allen's team immediately began excavating an entrance while Wheeler, Jack Henderson, and I prepared the equipment and supplies for transfer to the new shelter. The children helped Sarah, who had insisted on walking short distances when terrain allowed to maintain muscle function despite her illness. The interior of the maintenance building was in remarkably good condition. The structure had been designed to withstand extreme weather, with reinforced walls and minimal windows. Most importantly, it contained maintenance tools and emergency supplies that expanded our capabilities significantly. Vehicle repair equipment could be repurposed for mechanical needs, while industrial cleaning chemicals offered new possibilities for my distillation processes. We established a secure perimeter and divided the interior space efficiently, creating separate areas for sleeping, medical treatment, and equipment maintenance. The federal agents implemented military protocols for watch rotations and resource management, bringing welcome structure to our previously improvised approach. That evening, Captain Allen's team attempted radio contact, using both their equipment and components salvaged from the maintenance building. After several hours of careful frequency scanning, they detected a weak transmission from what appeared to be another government team, approximately 50 miles south of our position. The communication was brief and heavily distorted by atmospheric conditions, but confirmed the CDC facility remained operational with automated systems functioning as designed. The transmission also contained a disturbing update about the pathogen situation. Quarantine protocols had failed at 3 major evacuation centers, with infection rates accelerating beyond containment capability. The voice on the radio referred, to Protocol Omega, being implemented at facilities where the outbreak exceeded manageable parameters. Without explaining what that protocol entailed, Captain Allen's expression revealed his recognition of the term, though he declined to elaborate when questioned. Sarah Henderson's condition worsened during the night. Her fever returned despite Agent Patel's treatment, and her breathing became increasingly labored. Jack remained by her side continuously, speaking softly to her during periods of consciousness and maintaining physical contact, as if his presence alone might tether her to survival. Wheeler and Agent Patel conferred privately before approaching me with their assessment. The pneumonia had progressed to likely bacterial sepsis with limited treatment options available outside a proper medical facility. They estimated her survival probability at less than 20% without immediate intervention beyond our current capabilities. The implications were clear, but remained unspoken. Continuing our journey with Sarah in her condition would likely result in her death before reaching the CDC facility. Remaining at our current location to treat her would consume supplies needed for the journey, potentially endangering everyone. The calculation was coldly mathematical, with variables that extended beyond simple survival to include the broader mission of addressing the pathogen threat. Jack Henderson recognized the situation without requiring explicit explanation. When he finally spoke after hours at his wife's bedside, his decision reflected the transformed morality of our frozen world. "We continue tomorrow," he said simply. "Sarah would want the children to reach safety, and the work you need to do might help others like her." That night I took watch alongside Captain Allen, both of us monitoring the deteriorating weather conditions while the others rested. "You were military before becoming a distiller," he observed quietly. Not a question, but a recognition of certain behaviors and responses I had demonstrated during our journey. I confirmed briefly, explaining my background in chemical weapons detection and defense systems, experience that had later informed my more peaceful work in distillation science. The captain nodded thoughtfully, before sharing information he had previously withheld from the broader group. "Protocol Omega isn't just quarantine," he explained. "It's containment through controlled termination of the facility and all personnel. The pathogen has features suggesting deliberate engineering rather than natural evolution. Its cold adaptation appears designed specifically for scenarios like our current conditions." The implication was staggering. Not just a natural disaster compounded by disease, but potentially a coordinated attack using the volcanic event as cover for biological warfare. I asked if he had evidence beyond circumstantial timing. "Nothing definitive," he admitted, "but the transmission patterns, the specific protein, structures Wheeler has described, the targeted organ systems, all suggest optimization that rarely occurs naturally. Someone may have been preparing for this scenario long before the volcanoes erupted." Whether conspiracy theory or genuine threat assessment, the information added urgency to our mission beyond immediate survival. If the pathogen represented deliberate weaponization, the CDC facility's research capabilities became even more crucial for developing countermeasures. Morning brought both tragedy and unexpected opportunity. Sarah Henderson passed during the early hours, never regaining consciousness after her fever spiked beyond treatable levels. Jack sat with her body, his children pressed against him in shared grief. Their small family unit diminished but not broken by death that had claimed so many in our frozen world. We had no means to conduct proper burial with the ground frozen, solid. Captain Allen's team helped Jack wrap his wife's body in materials from the maintenance building, then secure it outside the structure where the extreme cold would preserve it until spring might eventually allow interment. The children watched the process with solemn understanding beyond their years, Emma supporting her brother physically while receiving emotional strength from her father. As final preparations were made for continuing our journey, Agent Ramirez made a discovery that dramatically changed our travel capabilities. The maintenance building's rear storage area, previously blocked by collapsed shelving, contained 2 snowmobiles used by utility workers for winter line maintenance. The vehicles had been properly winterized before abandonment and contained emergency fuel reserves. Captain Allen immediately assigned Agent Chen, who had mechanical expertise, to assess their functionality. After several hours of careful work in the extreme cold, she reported that one machine could be made operational, using parts from both. The functional snowmobile would not carry our entire party, but could transport critical personnel and equipment at speeds impossible on foot. The tactical decision was straightforward but emotionally complex. Wheeler, as the CDC representative with facility access codes and pathogen expertise, required priority transport. I would accompany him with the critical distillation equipment needed for the research mission. The others would follow our trail at their best possible speed, with the federal agents providing security and survival support for Jack Henderson and his children. Jack accepted the plan with the same stoic resilience he had shown throughout our journey. "Get there, make the machines work, help others," he said simply when I expressed concern about separating him from medical support. "We'll follow as we can." The snowmobile preparation took the remainder of the day, with all team members contributing to optimize the vehicle for our specific needs. The children helped sort supplies, their natural adaptability allowing them to participate in meaningful ways despite their recent loss. Emma maintained her protective stance toward Jake, but both showed signs of processing their grief through purposeful activity rather than emotional withdrawal. We departed at first light the following morning, the weather temporarily clear, though temperature readings remained near 60 below zero. Wheeler and I secured the essential equipment to the snowmobile, while Captain Allen provided final navigation coordinates and communication protocols. We would attempt radio contact at predetermined intervals to coordinate with the following party. Jack Henderson approached as we completed preparations, his children beside him. Without words, he extended his hand to each of us in turn, the gesture containing all that needed to be communicated between men facing impossible choices in an unforgiving world. Emma surprised me by offering a small folded paper, carefully preserved despite our journey's hardships. Inside was a child's drawing of what appeared to be distillation equipment, labeled Mr. Thad's Magic Machine. Jake simply nodded solemnly, his small face set in determination beyond his years. The snowmobile engine started on the third attempt. The sound shockingly loud after weeks of silence broken only by wind and human voices. Wheeler took the controls, his previous experience with similar vehicles making him the logical operator. I secured the equipment and myself behind him, and we began moving across the snow-covered landscape at a speed that seemed almost miraculous after our previous slow progress on foot. The journey by snowmobile created new challenges despite the increased speed. Visibility remained difficult in the featureless terrain, requiring constant reference to navigation equipment. Mechanical vibration and extreme cold combined to create physical stress that required regular stops to prevent hypothermia and equipment damage. The engine sound potentially attracted attention from any hostile forces in the region, though no signs of other human presence appeared during our first day of mechanized travel. We covered approximately 20 miles before requiring an extended stop for engine cooling and fuel conservation. During this pause, Wheeler attempted radio contact with the CDC facility, using equipment salvaged from the maintenance building. After several minutes of transmission attempts, we received an automated response indicating the facility's security systems remained active and requiring proper authentication protocols for entry. Wheeler provided his CDC identification codes and received confirmation that our approach had been logged in the facility's systems. The automated response indicated no human personnel were currently registering on internal monitors, suggesting the facility was operating in unmanned mode as designed for emergency scenarios. We resumed travel as another weather system approached from the west, pushing the snowmobile to its limits to reach our destination before conditions deteriorated beyond safe operation. The CDC facility appeared on the horizon late in the afternoon, its profile barely visible against the snow-covered landscape. The structure had been deliberately designed for low visibility, built into the side of what had once been a small hill, but now appeared as merely a variation in the otherwise flat terrain. As we approached the perimeter, automated security systems activated, scanning our vehicle and equipment before permitting closer access. Wheeler's identification codes granted us entry to the external airlock, a decontamination chamber designed to prevent outside contamination from reaching the facility's internal systems. The contrast between the killing cold outside and the controlled environment of the airlock was physically shocking. As the outer doors sealed behind us and decontamination protocols initiated, the temperature rose to just above freezing, feeling almost unbearably hot against skin adapted to extreme cold. Medical sensors embedded in the chamber walls automatically assessed our physical condition, displaying warnings about frostbite damage and potential hypothermia treatment requirements. Wheeler completed the security protocols while I secured our equipment, particularly the distillation components that would be crucial for the work ahead. When the inner doors finally opened, we entered a facility that seemed impossibly normal compared to the frozen apocalypse outside. The lighting was standard institutional illumination, the temperature a controlled 70 degrees, the air quality carefully filtered and humidified. The automated systems had maintained basic operations despite the absence of human personnel, with critical research areas preserved in standby mode ready for activation. Wheeler immediately accessed the central control systems, bringing additional sections online and assessing the facility's current status. The news was both encouraging and concerning. The geothermal heating system functioned perfectly, drawing heat from deep beneath the Earth's surface independent of external power requirements. Food supplies remained at 80% of capacity, sufficient for a small research team for several months. The laboratory equipment was intact and operational, including specialized viral analysis systems and pharmaceutical production capabilities. However, communication systems showed significant degradation, with satellite uplinks completely non-functional and radio capabilities limited to short-range transmission. Most concerning, the automated security logs showed multiple attempted breaches of the facility perimeter during the previous month, suggesting others had identified its value and attempted access without proper authorization. Wheeler initiated full system activation, while I began setting up the distillation equipment in the designated laboratory space. The specialized components we had transported would interface with the facility's existing systems, creating capabilities beyond what either possessed independently. The combination of my practical distillation knowledge and the CDC's advanced research equipment represented our best hope for addressing both immediate survival needs and the emerging pathogen threat. As critical systems came online, Wheeler accessed the CDC's secure databases containing the latest research on the pathogen before communications had failed. The information confirmed Captain Allen's disturbing suggestion of potential engineered origins. The microorganism showed genetic markers consistent with laboratory manipulation, with specific adaptations for cold weather transmission that would be highly improbable through natural evolution. Most alarming were the transmission vectors and infection progression documented in the research files. The pathogen initially presented as common respiratory illness, before attacking the central nervous system with devastating efficiency. Mortality rates in documented cases exceeded 80% once neurological symptoms appeared, and the transmission mechanism had evolved to utilize water systems, particularly melting snow and ice that survivors would necessarily consume. The implications were catastrophic. As temperatures eventually moderated and the ice began to melt, the pathogen would spread through water systems previously thought safe. Survivors who had endured the freeze might face a secondary extinction event unless countermeasures could be developed. Wheeler immediately began culturing samples from our own water supplies to test for pathogen presence using the facility's advanced detection systems. I focused on establishing the distillation processes that would be needed to produce both disinfection agents and pharmaceutical precursors, if treatment protocols could be developed. The first 24 hours in the facility passed in continuous work, our exhaustion overcome by the urgency of our mission and the relative comfort of the controlled environment. We attempted radio contact with Captain Allen's team at the predetermined intervals, but atmospheric conditions prevented clear communication. We could only hope they continued making progress toward the facility following our snowmobile tracks. On the second day, the security systems alerted us to movement at the perimeter. The external cameras showed a group of 8 individuals approaching from the northwest, their formation and equipment suggesting military training similar to Captain Allen's team. However, these were not our companions from the maintenance building. Wheeler activated the external communication system, challenging the approaching group to identify themselves. Their response was immediate and unexpected. CDC Security Division, Authorization Sierra Tango 719, Emergency Override Protocols initiated. The security codes were valid according to the facility's systems, but outdated by several months. Wheeler consulted the personnel databases, confirming no such security division was scheduled for deployment to this facility. The approaching group represented an unknown entity attempting to gain access using partially legitimate credentials. We implemented immediate security protocols, placing the facility in lockdown mode while maintaining communication capabilities. The approaching group became more aggressive in their demands for entry, claiming authority under emergency government, provisions that Wheeler knew had been superseded by current disaster protocols. As tension escalated with the unknown group outside, the facility's long-range sensors detected another approaching vehicle from the south, a specialized snow transport of military design containing approximately 12 individuals. The situation was developing into a potential conflict beyond our capability to manage with just 2 personnel. Wheeler made a critical decision based on our primary mission parameters. Rather than engaging directly with either approaching group, we would accelerate our research while maintaining facility security. The automated defense systems would prevent immediate breach while we focused on the scientific work that represented humanity's best hope against both the freeze and the pathogen. I established continuous distillation processes, creating both the sterile compounds needed for research and emergency medical supplies that would be crucial regardless of who ultimately controlled the facility. Wheeler divided his attention between pathogen analysis and monitoring the deteriorating security situation outside. On the 3rd day, as the 2 outside groups established positions on opposite sides of the facility and began what appeared to be preliminary negotiations with each other, our radio finally received a clear transmission from Captain Allen's team. They had made remarkable progress following our trail and were now approximately 5 miles south, approaching cautiously after detecting the other human presences near the facility. Wheeler provided Captain Allen with our security assessment and facility status. Allen recognized the tactical situation immediately. The 2 unknown groups were likely competing government factions with different objectives regarding the CDC research. His team would need to approach covertly to avoid being caught in potential crossfire. Most importantly, Allen reported that Jack Henderson and his children remained with his team, all having survived the journey thus far, though experiencing significant cold exposure and fatigue. The news provided personal motivation beyond the scientific mission, knowing that the facility's resources could save these people who had endured so much. That evening, as Wheeler continued analyzing water samples for pathogen presence, he made the discovery we had feared, but expected. The microorganism was present in meltwater samples taken near the facility, though in lower concentrations than documented in southern regions. The freeze had not eliminated the threat but merely slowed its progression. As temperatures eventually moderated, infection rates would accelerate exponentially. The scientific challenge was daunting, but not impossible. Using the facility's advanced research systems combined with my distillation processes, we identified potential treatment approaches targeting the pathogen's unique protein structures. The work would require time and resources beyond our current capabilities, but represented genuine hope rather than certain extinction. As we contemplated the research challenges ahead, the facility's security monitors alerted us to a new development outside. The 2 competing groups had noticed Captain Allen's approaching team and were repositioning to intercept them. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, with Jack Henderson and the children potentially caught in conflict beyond their understanding or involvement. Wheeler made another critical decision that reflected the transformed morality of our collapsed world. He activated the facility's emergency broadcast system, announcing to all parties that the CDC location contained confirmed pathogen samples and that inappropriate entry without decontamination protocols would risk catastrophic infection. The UN claim was technically true but deliberately misleading regarding the immediate risk level. The announcement created immediate changes in the outside group's behavior. Both competing factions withdrew to reassess, unwilling to risk exposure to the pathogen they had likely been sent to contain or control. This created a temporary opportunity for Captain Allen's team to approach via the service entrance Wheeler had identified in the facility schematics. The reunion with Jack Henderson and his children occurred in the facility's decontamination chamber, their exhausted but living presence a testament to human endurance beyond rational explanation. Emma maintained her protective stance toward Jake despite her own obvious fatigue, while their father's relief at reaching relative safety was evident in his otherwise stoic expression. Captain Allen immediately integrated his team with our security protocols, establishing defensive positions within the facility while maintaining observation of the outside groups. Agent Patel joined Wheeler in the research laboratory, her medical training complementing his virological expertise. The remaining federal agents secured critical systems and prepared for potential breach scenarios if negotiations with the outside groups failed. I found myself working alongside Jack Henderson to establish sustainable life support systems within the facility. His mechanical knowledge proved invaluable for optimizing the geothermal heating and water purification processes to accommodate our expanded group. The children were assigned appropriate tasks maintaining the living quarters, giving them purpose while preserving their safety. As our 10th day in the facility approached, with research progressing and security maintained despite continuing presence of the outside groups, Wheeler made a breakthrough in the pathogen analysis. The microorganism's cold adaptation represented both its greatest strength and potentially its critical vulnerability. Specific enzyme pathways required for virulence functioned only within narrow temperature ranges, creating a potential target for treatment development. The facility's communication systems, enhanced by Captain Allen's equipment, finally established reliable contact with other government installations. Wheeler transmitted our research findings through secure channels while requesting information about evacuation centers, particularly the Western facility where Eliza worked. The response was delayed but eventually confirmed her continued survival and contribution to agricultural projects designed to function in the altered climate conditions. The knowledge that my daughter lived, that her specialized knowledge was proving as valuable in this transformed world as my own, provided personal hope beyond the scientific progress we were making. The path forward remained uncertain, with competing factions outside our doors and a pathogen threatening what remained of humanity. But within the relative safety of the facility, surrounded by people who had survived the impossible, I found something I had not experienced since the freeze began: the conviction that human adaptation might yet overcome even this extinction-level threat. Today marks day 78 since the freeze began. The world outside remains locked in ice, but something is moving beneath the surface. Wheeler's latest tests show something in the meltwater, something that does not belong there. My distillation skills may soon be needed for a different kind of survival, but the children now attend improvised classes in the facility's conference room, learning skills for the world that will emerge from this catastrophe. Jack Henderson leads the mechanical maintenance team, ensuring our long-term viability. Captain Allen negotiates cautiously with the outside groups, seeking common purpose rather than conflict. The temperature outside registers 65 below zero this morning. Inside, we maintain 70 degrees through geothermal systems independent of the collapsed infrastructure beyond our walls. The contrast represents everything about our current existence: islands of adaptation surrounded by lethal conditions. Yet humanity has always defined itself by the ability to create shelter from hostile environments, to transform raw materials into survival tools, to distill complexity into essential elements. I am Thaddeus Kellerman, Master Distiller. I have survived 78 days of an Ice Age apocalypse through the application of knowledge and the formation of community. What comes next will test us further, as the pathogen presents challenges beyond mere cold. But standing in my laboratory, watching the precise separation of compounds that might save what remains of our species, I find myself thinking not of what we have lost, but of what we might yet create from the essential elements that remain.